15 men, 15 white hoods, 15 men who had spent decades building their power on the certainty that certain people would not fight back. 15 men who had burned churches, terrorized neighborhoods, and operated in the dark for so long they had forgotten something essential. They had forgotten that the dark belongs to everyone. They had no idea what they had just done. They had no idea whose nephew they had taken. And they had absolutely no idea what was coming for them in the next 48 hours. Nobody warned them. Nobody could have. Because the man whose blood they had just insulted never advertised his power. He didn't need to. In Harlem, you didn't hear about Bumpy Johnson. You felt him, like a shift in pressure before a storm, like the silence that falls over a room when the temperature drops 5 degrees and something in your body understands, before your mind does, that something is wrong. By the time those 15 men understood what they had done, they were not making demands. They were not threatening anyone. They were on their knees, and they were begging. This is the story that nearly no one was supposed to survive to tell. New York City, Harlem, summer of 1959. To understand what happened, you need to understand what Harlem was in 1959. Not the caricature, not the poverty postcard, the real Harlem, a city within a city, a place with its own economy, its own law, its own hierarchy, and its own code. And at the center of that code, at the center of everything that moved and breathed and mattered in those 49 blocks, there was one man, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Known to everyone from the pool halls on 125th Street to the federal courtrooms on Foley Square by a single name, Bumpy. He was not a large man. He was not what Hollywood later imagined him to be. He was compact, precise, with a poet's vocabulary and a mathematician's mind. He read voraciously. He wrote his own poetry. He could quote Shakespeare and Langston Hughes with equal fluency. He had a soft voice that never needed to rise to be heard. He had tired eyes that had seen too much too clearly for too long. He wore suits that were not expensive by accident. He carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who has made peace with violence precisely because he has used it so thoroughly that it no longer excites him. He had survived the Harlem Wars of the 30s. He had survived federal prosecution, Rikers Island, Alcatraz, and 3 separate attempts on his life by men who were no longer in a position to try again. He had buried friends, enemies, and a few people who had been both at different points. He had watched presidents come and go. He had watched neighborhoods transform. He had watched Harlem absorb every assault the century had offered and remain, stubborn and luminous and alive. And through all of it, one thing had never changed. He protected what was his. His nephew Marcus was 22 years old in the summer of 1959. A quiet young man, studying electrical engineering at City College, the first in the family to attend university. He had his uncle's stillness, his uncle's careful eyes, and absolutely none of his uncle's notoriety. To anyone looking at Marcus on the street, he was simply a young black man carrying textbooks in a city that was many things at once. He was not famous. He was not dangerous. He was simply someone's son, someone's student, someone's hope. He was also Bumpy Johnson's blood. The men who took him on a Tuesday evening did not know that last part. That is not an excuse. It is simply the last piece of information they had before everything changed. The group had driven up from Virginia. They called themselves organizers, which was the word they used when they wanted to feel like more than what they were. They had been emboldened by years of backlash against the civil rights movement, energized by the quiet permission certain politicians gave with their silence, and convinced in the specific way that cowards convince themselves of things, that their geography offered them safety. They were in New York. They were moving fast. They believed that chaos was protection, that numbers were strength, and that no one in Harlem would pursue them past the city limits. They grabbed Marcus 2 blocks from his apartment building at dusk. 3 men from the front, 4 from the sides, the rest in 2 vehicles idling at the curb. It was professionally executed, which tells you something about how many times they had done something like this before. It took 11 seconds. By the time anyone on the street processed what had happened, the cars were already turning south on Lenox Avenue. Marcus had not fought. He was 22 years old, and there were 15 of them, and he made the intelligent decision to stay alive long enough for something to change. He was smart. He was Bumpy's nephew, after all. The phone call came to Bumpy's apartment on Edgecombe Avenue at 9:47 that night. One of his men delivered the message personally, because some information cannot be trusted to a telephone. He stood in the doorway and said 6 words. Marcus was taken. White men. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. He could see from Bumpy's expression that everything that came next was already in motion. Bumpy Johnson sat with that information for approximately 45 seconds. That is not a metaphor. People who were in the room that night described it the same way, years later, in careful voices. He sat completely still. He asked 2 questions: where and who. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to the telephone himself. What happened in the next 4 hours is the part that most people get wrong, because they expect it to look like what they have seen in movies. It did not look like movies. It looked like a man making phone calls. It looked quiet. Bumpy Johnson made 11 calls in 90 minutes. He spoke to people in Harlem, in Brooklyn, in downtown Manhattan, in New Jersey, and in 2 cities in Virginia. He spoke calmly. He never raised his voice. He asked questions and received answers. He said please and thank you in a way that left no room for interpretation about what he was actually saying, which was not please and thank you at all. By midnight, he knew the names. Not most of them, all of them. 15 names, 15 addresses, 15 families, 15 employers, 15 license plates. Information does not hide from a man who has spent 30 years building the infrastructure of an entire parallel civilization. Information travels. Information wants to be known. Bumpy Johnson simply had better pipes than most men. He also knew where Marcus was being held. A property in rural Virginia, 3 hours south, owned by a man whose name appeared on no official document, but whose relationship to the group was well understood by people who tracked these things. Marcus was alive. He was frightened. He had not been physically harmed. That information arrived at 12:19 in the morning, and Bumpy received it without visible relief, because relief was not yet appropriate. Marcus was alive for now. That was conditional. Everything after midnight was about changing the condition. Here is what the 15 men did not understand about Bumpy Johnson. They understood in the abstract that he was powerful. They had probably heard his name. Power in the abstract is manageable. You can dismiss it. You can tell yourself it doesn't apply to you, that you are different, that your geography or your numbers or your righteousness, however you define that word, protects you. That is what abstractions allow you to do. They allow you to feel safe. What they did not understand is that Bumpy Johnson's power was not abstract. It was structural. It was woven into the functioning of systems they depended on without knowing they depended on them. Trucking routes, supply chains, the informal economies that existed beneath the formal ones, the ones that made the formal ones possible. He had not built this power in order to use it violently. He had built it because power was the only language the world consistently responded to, and he had been a student of language since he was old enough to read. The violence, when it came, was always the last sentence of a very long paragraph that most people never had the patience to read from the beginning. The 15 men had skipped straight to the end. They had not read the paragraph. By 2 in the morning, the men began to notice things, small things. A supplier in Richmond who had always answered calls stopped answering. A contact in Washington who moved certain goods changed his number overnight. A meeting that had been scheduled for Wednesday morning was canceled without explanation. A piece of property that 2 of the men rented through an intermediary received an unexpected notice. Coincidences if you believe in them. A pattern, if you're paying attention. By 6 in the morning on Wednesday, the pattern was undeniable. By noon, the first of the 15 made a call to a number he had been given by a man in Harlem who had reached out to a cousin who worked maintenance at a building on 116th Street. The message was simple. We didn't know whose boy that was. We want to talk. Bumpy did not take that call. The second call came by 3 in the afternoon. A different man, more desperate, using the word mistake with the specific inflection of someone who has just realized that a mistake and a choice are the same thing, distinguished only by whether you got caught. Bumpy did not take that call either. The third call came through a different channel entirely, this time from a man in Virginia who served as something between a lawyer and a liaison for certain groups, and who had spent enough years operating in gray spaces to understand, with professional clarity, that the gray space had just evaporated. He spoke to one of Bumpy's men on the street. He said the boy would be returned unharmed. He said the men responsible were prepared to accept any reasonable terms. He said, in words he chose with great care, that they had underestimated the situation. Bumpy's man listened to all of this. He said nothing in response. He reported it faithfully. Bumpy heard the report. He thought for a moment. Then he said, they used the word reasonable. Yes, his man confirmed. He said, tell them I'll define reasonable. What Bumpy asked for was not what 15 panicked men had expected. He did not ask for money, though they had offered it. He did not ask for a display of submission, though that would have been understandable. He did not ask for anything that could be filmed or photographed or turned into a story that would require a response. He was too intelligent for theater. He asked for 4 things. Marcus returned by nightfall on Thursday, unharmed, door to door in Harlem. Written information on every similar operation the group had conducted in the past 3 years. Names, locations, dates, delivered to a specific address by the same deadline. A withdrawal, permanent and complete, from any activity north of Richmond. And a single phone call, made by the leader of the group himself, to a specific number, during which he would speak 2 sentences and nothing else. The 2 sentences were not threats. They were not humiliating. They were simply an acknowledgement. 20 words long. Bumpy had written them himself. Marcus arrived home Thursday at 7:41 in the evening. He walked through the door of his family's apartment on his own 2 feet, wearing the same clothes he had left in, carrying his textbooks. He was quiet. He was shaken in the way that a person is shaken when they have stood very close to something terrible and understood, with their entire body, how close the margin was. He sat at the kitchen table. His mother put food in front of him. He ate. Bumpy came by the apartment at 9. He didn't stay long. He sat across from Marcus for a few minutes. He didn't ask what happened during the hours Marcus was held. He asked how the engineering coursework was going. He asked about a professor Marcus had mentioned the previous month. He asked if Marcus needed anything for his apartment. Small questions. The questions of an uncle, not a criminal. Marcus looked at him for a long moment before answering. He said, "They were scared of you before they even knew what you were going to do." Bumpy considered this. He said, "The most dangerous thing a person can be is predictable." He paused. "Once people know you will always protect what is yours, most problems solve themselves before they become problems." Marcus said, "They almost didn't call. 2 of them wanted to run." Bumpy said, "The ones who wanted to run were the smart ones." He said it without arrogance. It was almost clinical. They understood the situation faster. The other 13 cost everybody more time. He stood up. He put his hand briefly on his nephew's shoulder. He told Marcus's mother the food was very good, because it was, and because he never neglected the courtesies. Then he put on his hat and walked out into the Harlem night. The written information arrived as requested. It was passed to individuals who passed it to other individuals who passed it to journalists and investigators and advocates who had been trying to document exactly that kind of activity for years. It broke open 3 separate investigations. It put 2 men in federal custody within 18 months. It protected a number of families whose names never appeared in any newspaper because protection, when it works, is invisible. The phone call was made. The leader of the group dialed the number at 11 in the morning on Thursday, 3 hours before Marcus was released, as Bumpy had specified. He spoke the 2 sentences. His voice was not steady. The call lasted 31 seconds, including the time it took for him to compose himself enough to speak. The person on the other end of the line said nothing. The line went dead. Nobody ever moved on Harlem again with that kind of intention. Not that group, not anything connected to them, not, as far as anyone could trace, anything connected to them. Whether that was caution or fear, or simply the recognition that the calculation didn't add up, it didn't matter. The result was the same. Bumpy Johnson died 9 years later, in 1968, at a restaurant in Harlem, in the middle of a meal, of heart failure. He was 59 years old. He died as he had lived, at a table, thinking, surrounded by people who had known him long enough to understand that the city would feel different without him. The obituaries were complicated. They always are for men who operated in spaces that official language doesn't have clean words for. But in Harlem, the feeling was simple. He had kept his word, every time, to everyone who had earned it. He had protected what was his, every time, with whatever the situation required. And he had never once needed to announce that he would. 15 men drove up from Virginia that summer, believing that certain people would not fight back. They drove back understanding that they had confused stillness for weakness and quiet for nothing. They had confused the absence of performance for the absence of power. And those 15 men spent the rest of their lives knowing, in the particular way that the body knows things that the mind prefers not to say out loud, that they had stood in a room they did not understand, with a man they had not seen clearly, and that the only reason they walked out of that room at all was because he allowed it. Bumpy Johnson never talked about what happened that summer. Not to journalists, not to courtroom investigators, not to anyone who wrote it down while he was alive. He had better things to read. He had poetry to write. He had a city to walk through, unhurried, in a well-pressed suit, greeting people by name, because in Harlem everyone knew him, and he had made it his business to know everyone back. That was his real power. Not the phone calls, not the 14 names delivered by midnight, not the network that stretched into Virginia like roots under pavement. The real power was simpler than any of that. He understood, at a level most men never reach, that the most formidable thing in any room is not the loudest voice or the largest presence. It is the person who already knows the answer and is simply waiting, with infinite patience, for everyone else to catch up. 15 men learned that in 48 hours. Bumpy Johnson had known it his entire life. If this story changed the way you think about power, silence, and what it truly means to protect the people you love, then you understand why this channel exists. Subscribe now, because here we don't chase noise. We study the people who didn't need to make any. Turn on notifications and become part of a community that looks beneath the surface of history to find the lessons that were never meant to be taught in any classroom. And remember this, the most powerful move you will ever make is the one no one sees coming. And the most dangerous thing you can become is the person no one thought to take seriously. We'll see you in the next one.